Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited about my guest today. My guest today is Daniel Cortez. Daniel has spent the last 15 years of his life overcoming illness and re-examining everything he thought he knew about health, wellness, and performance. He finally realized that conventional medicine had no answers for his health problems, and he became his own advocate to heal his own chronic disease. He now guides clients with an uncommon combination of wellness modalities, pulling extensively from evolutionary science, modern psychology, and ancestral wisdom. Also, the Ancestral Health Symposium is right out around the corner. I will be presenting on evolutionary perspectives of our thyroid. It is one of my favorite conferences of the year, and I hope to see you there. I hope you enjoy the show.
Hello everyone, super excited to have my friend Daniel Cortez here with me. Daniel, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Guillermo. Thanks for having me, man.
Dude, we had such a great conversation on that Facebook Live for the Ancestral Health Symposium that, I was like, I got to have this dude back on my show. Just for anyone that maybe didn't watch the Facebook Live or are not familiar with your work, what's your hero story? How do you come to this ancestral movement?
So basically what happened was I was a fairly healthy kid, pretty athletic and into sports and stuff. And then when I went to college, I went to work in El Salvador for a week, got a gut parasite, didn't know that I had it. That lasted for years because I didn't have any kind of classical symptoms. I just had like some brain fog and some fatigue and some bloating, but I didn't, I wasn't throwing up all over the place. And, that continued for years until I found it and got rid of it working abroad in Mexico. And then I thought it was fine, but really I didn't know at all how to take care of myself. And so what ended up happening is that after that, I started getting these strange symptoms of joint pain and all kinds of other things and brain fog. And that continued to get worse and worse and worse. And eventually I started to try to do what I thought was a good idea, which is I tried a vegan, gluten-free, soy-free diet. I was actually doing a pretty good job, relatively speaking. Like I didn't have any omega-6 seed oils, soaking like nuts and seeds and using the Vega products so that I would get plenty of B vitamins. And even though I didn't know that much at the time, I thought, I'm doing pretty well. But that actually just made me get way worse. And I nearly lost all my cognitive ability. So I nearly lost all the ability to read. And this was while I was getting a law degree. And so obviously not being able to read and getting a law degree are not compatible. I barely, got out of that. And at that point, I was kind of at my lowest point. And that lasted, all of that stuff lasted a long time. But especially right after the bout with veganism, I went back to a subject that had interested me for nearly my whole life, which was there are a few subjects that have interested me that I now look back on it and I say, oh, of course, this is how I came to live in Peru, and do what it is that I do, which is a very strange and different thing. And I was always interested in mythology. I was really interested in history. That's what my undergrad degree is in. And I was really interested in anthropology and evolutionary biology. In my younger life, I really focused more on reading about mythology and history and didn't go deep into evolutionary biology. A little bit of it into anthropology, but now, once I got really, really sick, and then I saw what happened when I tried veganism in a way that I thought was fairly intelligent at the time, I rethought everything, and then I started to do a deep dive, and I just started listening to books because I still was struggling with reading. I just couldn't focus. I was listening to audiobooks and podcasts and going back and rethinking everything from this anthropological and evolutionary biology-based perspective because it didn't. I always had the sinking suspicion, and this is from when I was very young, that everything that modern humans did, it was very, very myopic, right? We seemed to do things that had no foundation in any kind of tradition or connection to nature. And when I was younger, I couldn't really put my finger on why it bothered me so much. but it seemed that people did things that were fairly mindless, and that there wasn't a lot of rhyme or reason to why we did things, particularly around health. Of course, later on, the more I read about modern hunter-gatherers and then anthropological records, I realized that, we are so divorced from nature that it's no wonder that we don't have a good map for how human beings actually should live. And so once I realized that, it was then a quick leap to the ancestral health movement. And then I started rethinking everything from movement to sleep to nutrition to a sense of community and tribe to relationships with romantic partners, to everything that I could think of. I wanted to just drill as deeply as I could into basically building a mental map based on evolutionary biology and anthropology for everything about our lives as modern humans, because I realized that it should be obvious to everybody, even if they're not part of this movement, that the way that we are doing things in the modern Western world is completely unsustainable and destructive. Even if you don't really care about environmentalism or anything like that, you just have to face the fact that human beings are extremely unhealthy in the modern Western world by almost every measure.
It's funny how you mentioned, not having a map or a blueprint. We don't have a book or a codex, but we do have oral history, and we do have tradition, and we do have, but we just don't pay attention to it.
That's true. And here's the thing about that, though, is like, this is the subject of, I'm sure you know at this point who Jordan Peterson is.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, and there's a great cognitive scientist out of the University of Toronto as well, who's Peterson's colleague, named John Vervaeke, whose work I'm very interested in and I've been reading a lot of. And there are more and more people now who are talking, myself included in my own way, my perspective coming from a connection to nature and psychedelic plant medicines in particular. But there are more and more people talking about this very problem, which is that over time, we kept essentially inventing or evolving these psychotechnologies. That's Vervaeke's term, like literacy, for example, right? And so you move over historical time, you move towards modern science, right? And that's really only that way of thinking is a few hundred years old, and you could maybe make the argument that it started really in ancient Greece, so a few thousand years old, right? 2,000 years old, more or less. So that's a very short amount of time, and what's happening is that we keep changing how the software is running, so to speak, right? We keep changing how the brain is running to a degree. We're not really changing the size of the brain or anything like that. We've been the same, at least brain size-wise, as far as I understand, for all of modern Homo sapiens history, which is 200,000 to 300,000 years. But we're changing the way that the software works, and the problem is that the software is also really, or I should say, all the systems that make up you are really, really, really old, right? And so that's why people like Carl Jung came up with this idea of the collective unconscious, that there were memories that were shared between all human beings because they're embedded in our nervous system, because they're so evolutionarily old. And so we've got this kind of battle where we've become, in the modern Western world, we championed this scientific worldview, which brings tremendous value. But the problem is you become very arrogant that way, in a way, right? Because you think that you are so intelligent that you'll be able to discover everything, and you'll be able to figure out all the answers with this one kind of mode of thinking. And the problem, it seems, is that without underlying structure of some kind of tradition and really good maps of the world, you end up with these serious problems of lack of meaning in society, right? Because just technological advancement doesn't actually give you meaning. It doesn't actually make you healthy. And so we're struggling with that really right now, in my view.
And we get things wrong. Look at psychotherapy. There's an awesome episode of This American Life that I'll link into the show notes about how, it was, I think, like 40 years ago or 50 years ago, it was encouraged not to pick up a kid that was crying. And then they started doing some animal experiments, and they saw how animals didn't thrive if they weren't being nurtured. or just from like the work of Freud to the work of Jean Piaget, just observing kids how they work and how that radically changed our approach to psychiatry. And that's in the span of 20, 30 years, probably less. And you have this new school of thought. This is now how we're going to treat our kids. And this is now, the newest, most, and when you think about it, all of these things have been in traditional societies without the need of a PhD, without the need of further education, without the need to publish a double-blind placebo-controlled, paper. So this work is not revolutionary. This work is just basically recreating the wheel and putting it on paper.
Exactly. And so, because this is my point about, falling in love with the intellect, right? You create something, you're like, oh, no, this is the way you're going to do it. You're not going to pick them up when they're crying. Why? Well, you create some kind of rationale that you were able to think of with your logical mind that's based on a very short time span of research, right? And thinking that you don't even realize is deeply embedded in this culture that you grew up in. You don't have a frame of reference. The psychiatrists who came up with this, they didn't have a frame of reference for pre-industrialized peoples who don't have modern disease would do anything. And this is the problem. It's like, we see this in the psychedelic world all the time. It's like they want to take modern Western people, they want to take the plant, and they want to take it out of the tradition, the ceremony completely. And then they want to reconfigure it because it's very easy to say, well, biochemically, I see what I think is going on here. And so, well, that's all that's really going on here. We can just take that plant, that medicine, and treat it like a pharmaceutical. Of course, they don't realize that's what they're doing, but they're going to take it out of any kind of tradition and then use it and expect that that kind of technology is going to work the same way. And it's just not true. This is essentially the problem that we see, in my opinion. I think it's yours as well, considering what you and I are passionate about, is this is what we see in everything from nutrition to raising children to approaching trauma, whatever it is around health, and what it means to be a human, which is not to say that indigenous peoples did things always the way that we should do them, right? It's not the same. But what I am saying is that you should do things the way they've always been done at a deep kind of mythological level, unless you have really, really, really good reasons to not do that. And even then, you should be conservative about your changes.
You are an expert when it comes to psychoactive, plants or psychedelic. What's the right term?
I don't think that, I don't think that it matters.
Yeah, here we go again, trying to put a name on something, Okay, you're an expert on plant medicine. That's what you said.
I would say that more of an expert on psychedelics. Now, I'm definitely not an expert on plant medicine in general, because there are so many plants that don't have those reactions that are not, and even of those, I'm really an expert in using a few of them.
And I respect that so much, because so many times I've seen a post where like, hey, I have a cough. What should I try? And people would say, oh, you need to try, some uva ursi because it's antibacterial, or you need to try some turmeric, or they'll throw a couple of plants. And the problem in this herbal medicine world is that plants can affect so many things, okay? It was a joke, or it was like kind of like this inside joke, whenever you go to a presentation, or you go to an herbalist conference, or you go, they'll say, you need to use lavender because it's antibacterial, antiviral, it's a carminative, which helps with your gut health. It's an adaptogen, and it helps you relax. And you need to try oregano because it's an antiviral, it's an antibacterial, it's a carminative, and it helps you relax. And you need to try chamomile because it's a antibacterial. It's so like you can, there's so many constituents within a plant that they can act in so many different ways, and you can pretty much say that any plant can do anything. And I don't like that. I like specificity for certain situations. I did a lot of work with antivirals and antibacterials. When people ask me, oh, what about this plant? You go and do a presentation on the antivirals and antibacterials. Have you tried using garlic? Have you tried using this? I spent 4 years of my life working 8 hours, a day, Monday through Sunday, weekends and everything, trying to understand 4 plants. And when you start, ask, what about this one? What about the other one? It would be impossible for one person to be able to be an expert on every single plant in this world. So I really appreciate that, that you do have some specificity and you do have some expertise and you're trying to master or, getting more acquainted with a very specific type of medicine. And that I really appreciate that. And I really, resonate with that. Before we start talking about the specific psychedelics or medicine plants that you are familiar with, for someone that is completely oblivious to this world, what would be your elevator pitch, or how would you introduce someone that is a complete noob to this concept of using plant medicine? Maybe not because they have depression, maybe not because they have some trauma, maybe just for overall health. How would you explain the deep impact this medicine can have?
Well, before I say that, just let me also add to the last question and say that it kind of pains me to hear myself say I'm an expert. I don't like to say that at all. I'm a person who works with them. I revere them. I consider it my purpose to work with them and to help people with them. But I'm just a student.
Dude, of the 4 plants that I studied, okay, we always were looking for more money for research and to advance our research. And people would tell us, yeah, whenever you find the one compound within the plant that makes it antiviral, then we'll fund you. Because they're not interested in funding a whole plant. Conspiracy, aluminum foil hat, you cannot patent a whole plant. So then I spent an extra year after I graduated school, after I did all my research, published papers and whatever, trying to find the one compound. And we did. And even after finding that one compound, I cannot for sure say, oh, Melissa officinalis is the best antiviral, because there's so many plants out there. There's so many things. So I agree, the more you know, the more overwhelmed you are with the amount of information that we don't know. And it's funny that, if you scratch at the surface of plant medicine, you kind of get a little bit ballsy and you're like, oh yeah, I can treat this with this and this and this. And the deeper and deeper you get into actually understanding how plants tick, you are like, oh, wait. I'm not sure if this is the best solution, because it is incredible how powerful these little things are and how much damage you can do by using the wrong plant. It's expert because I've spent so many hours in there, but maybe I'm an expert in pipetting things from a test tube to another, but in no way, would I ever say that I understand a plant.
Yeah, exactly. With respect to your last question about the impact and the kind of, if I had to give an elevator pitch, I'm actually a person who is in a way an evangelist for this kind of work, but it's only in the context of the traditional setting, and then preferably the way I do it in the context of evolutionary health or ancestral health. You know what I mean? So I actually don't recommend that most people use these things, which is strange for someone in this world. It's not common, because I think that these things are incredibly powerful, and without really good maps to kind of ground you, these things can be very dangerous. But what I would say, if I was giving the elevator pitch about the incredible healing capacities of them, what I would say is something like, you should do the things that people have always done, and people have always sought altered states for healing. And they've done this through music and drumming and dancing. They've done this through fasting. They've done this through long periods of isolation in nature. And they've done this through their coevolution with psychedelic plants. Of that, there can be no doubt. And I think that to ignore their massive healing potential is a major mistake. So I would say that if you adopt the evolutionary biology and the anthropologically based view of the world, which is, in my view, the best map that exists, that gets back to our discussion of maps. Why is the map of ancestral health so powerful? Because it's the best map. It's the closest to what's true that we have in the modern Western world. And you need a map that gives you explanatory power. And part of that map would include the use of these plants, or it could include the use of these plants, but most certainly it would include the use of mechanisms or technologies, we'll call them, to get you into altered states of consciousness. Breath work can also do this too. I mean, I teach the Wim Hof method, and I've taught other types of breath work as well. The world of altered states, whether it's flow state, whether it's the complete dissolution of what most people refer to as the ego, there's a tremendous amount of profundity to be gathered from these experiences, and there is much more to be gathered if you have a map of the world that it fits into.
So you say, okay, I'm gonna give a talk, and you don't know who's gonna show up, and it's a bunch of people that have never heard about paleo or have never listened to Joe Rogan, or just a random group of people. How would you start your pitch? When I start talking about paleo to a group of people that never heard it, I talk about my struggles with weight, my struggles with untraceable symptoms, and how changing my diet actually changed me. And they're like, "Oh, I have those symptoms. Maybe I should try this."
Yes, exactly. Right. So you always have to meet people where they're at, right? Any good clinician or any good coach or practitioner of any kind has to do that, I think. And then you have to figure out how to slowly help them understand what the map really looks like, right? So what I do is I tell them about overcoming my own chronic illness. So like I said, I was ill for about 15 years. When I went a couple of years ago to Peru for the first time, I live in the Sacred Valley for your listeners. I live in the Sacred Valley of Peru near Cusco, which is the town that people fly into to go to Machu Picchu. And so I work here. I work online. I have my own coaching business, but I also work here. And I study these medicines, right? So what I did was I went to the Amazon jungle and started working with a teacher of mine who only specializes in ayahuasca. And then I went up to the valley because the valley is is very high up. I live at 9,000 something feet, and so I started working there, and I had an experience with a medicine that I work with still, but it's very, very uncommon, called Wilca. And it's the seed of a tree. It's blown up your nose. It's insufflated, which is the proper term. And I had the experience at the end of the experience of hearing a voice in my own consciousness that said, "You're not sick and you never were." And from that moment, I started to heal. And so what I would say is that these things, at the very least, these different plant medicines, they seem to have the ability, or not they seem, they do have the ability to help someone gain distance from the stories and attachments that they have been telling themselves, and then to accept and let them go. So face them and then accept them and let them go. And in the case of attachments, or in the case of pieces of your personality, of your identity, you can also individuate them in the words of Jung. So that would mean to kind of integrate them into your own personality. I usually start out with something in that ballpark. I tell people essentially, look, these things have the power, when used very intelligently in the right way and never carelessly, they have the power to help you see the things that are illusions and that you don't need to hold on to. So in my case, I was holding on to this piece of identity, which was, I am sick. Now, from a scientific perspective, that's not true, right? We know that epigenetics, the intersection of, or the interaction between your genes and environment, is not really who you are, because we know that your genes can change expression. It's why, for example, you started to feel so much better when you changed your diet and made all of these changes in your life, and the same for me. But because the mind wants to create continuity, presumably, you get stuck in this I am. Buddhists and Taoists and obviously people who have been using psychedelic plants have been grappling with this for thousands of years. The illusion of the self and all kinds of concepts that come up when it comes to these kind of altered states experiences, where you can gain separation between the thing that you always think that you are, your identity, and reality. And so reality is, from my perspective, is that you are an animal that's a symbiotic animal of bacterial and human cells, constantly changing, constantly moving forward. The trick is, can you kind of understand, confront all of that, and then accept it as really what you are, and burn off, like dead wood, all of the identity and attachment stuff that is actually making you suffer.
And this is not just for pain associated with grief or maybe pain like anxiety. There's a great book by John Sarno called Healing Back Pain, The Mind-Body Connection. And
yeah, it is great.
Yeah, John Stossel did a pretty cool segment because he suffers from back pain. And this is back in, 90s, early 2000s. And he didn't get any relief, and he was considering surgery or whatever. And he found this dude, John Sarno, MD, who was healing people from back pain. This is an MD with just understanding and let it go of the pain. And that physical pain went away by reading a book. And if that isn't powerful, imagine if you could have a substance that actually helps you change the structure of your brain and reroute, the way you're thinking in a very physical way. You can have pretty impactful results.
Yeah, that's completely true. One thing is that, again, I tell people this all the time. I think it's taken a little while for me to get here, but I more and more embrace many other paths to get to a similar place. My path is this one. It's for sure, right? So this is my path, and I spend as much time as I can in nature, nurturing that connection, right? Because that's a big part of, in my view, the way that these plants, or the true value of these plants, which is not really being understood very well in the Western world, because again, it's being taken out of nature and taken out from the locale where they actually grow, and it's being done without, for the most part, being done without any kind of connection to a tradition or any kind of map with explanatory power. But I think that there's all of the ways that you can take information and make it conscious to you, whether it's reading a book, whether it's doing breath work, whether it's doing ecstatic dance, whatever it is. There's all kinds of ways to relieve nervous system tension and solve a lot of these problems of modern Western civilization. There are a lot of different ways, so yeah, that book is fantastic.
I love plants because it's not like you can just grab a vine and, eat it and that's it. You have medicine. You gotta have intention in order for you to be able to unleash the healing powers of nature. So the example that I always give is like if you're having a piece of pizza and you put oregano on top of it, that oregano is not going to be antibacterial. You actually have to prepare it, and you have to have intention, and you have to have the knowledge on how to make this plant material biologically active. It might have other benefits, like macronutrient benefits. It might have, help with digestion, and maybe that's why we use the spices on top of food. But if you want to make it a powerful antibiotic, you have to actually extract it in a very specific way. I give this example during my talks. We had a plant that was super effective at killing MRSA. It was very effective. It was working and working. One day it stopped working. And we were like, okay, what the hell is happening here? We started trying other plants and they kept working, but this specific plant was not active anymore. And we kind of reverse engineer what we're doing, and we found that the tincture we were getting used to be dried leaf, and the herbalist had switched the recipe to do it with fresh leaf because he believed, that it was going to be more active because it was fresh and it had more vital force or whatever. Well, he was wrong. The plant was only antibacterial if that leaf had been oxidized. There is a reason we don't walk around with resistant bacteria in our gut, because we are not using these plants specifically for their antibacterial activity unless we prepare them in that way. Now, really funny story, or really curious story when it comes to ayahuasca. Even the most expert and most seasoned herbalists have trouble making the ayahuasca preparation. How do you think we were able to discover this really difficult process?
I think that the traditional explanation by indigenous people that the plants told them is true. Even though this is what I do, it's still hard at this point. I suspect at some point it won't be hard, but I think it's still hard for me to fully understand that, because even though I'm way closer to all of these things than, 99.9% of people, I still don't live in the forest. I still live in a home, you know what I mean? And I still haven't grown up my entire existence noticing everything about a particular landscape and having a deep connection to all of the plants, essentially, and animals around me. And so I suspect that among hunter-gatherers, that the connection is so strong that in some way they are able to, one, intuit a lot of things by feel that end up being true scientifically. And two, I think that there are just things that likely we don't understand about plant intelligence, probably tons and tons and tons of things we don't understand about plant intelligence, and that in some way they were instructed to combine them. And I honestly don't know.
When I had Diana Rogers on the show, we're talking about this, plants' ability to survive and to evolve. They are co-evolving with us. These plants are not giving us these things because they're gifts to us, because we're the supreme beings of the universe. They are creating these different bioactive molecules for a reason. And in our smugness, we look at plants and we believe we're above them. We believe that we are the controllers of the plant or whatever. But if aliens that were moving at closer to the speed of light came and looked at us, and we were moving so slow, because we're not near the speed of light, they would see us and they would be looking at something that looks a lot like a plant. And maybe they are way more sophisticated than us, creating root networks that communicate with each other. They're communicating with each other through pollen and other aromatics and other signals. And they are living, breathing creatures. They just happen to move way slower than us. And because they move slower, we don't appreciate their complexity. These plants are not here for us. These plants, they are co-evolving and they are doing all this stuff. We can learn to utilize them. We can learn to make them into medicine, or we can learn to take advantage of their properties. But these plants are co-evolving with us. I like to talk about like caffeine or nicotine, and how, the caffeine in chocolate and the caffeine in coffee are convergent evolutionary products, meaning that we care so much for caffeine, okay, that the coffee plant produces caffeine by, I don't remember exactly which one does what, but one of those plants breaks down a molecule and creates caffeine, and the other one builds a molecule and creates caffeine. And this is evolutionary advantageous for these plants because we pamper those plants that produce caffeine. In anything, any alkaloid, like nicotine, or even things like amphetamines, like ephedra plant, we kind of care for that plant. And then the question is, who is controlling who? Is the plant doing this so we can pamper it, or are we so smug that we think that we are controlling the plant? Because I know a lot of people out there really love their coffee. So it's so strange to believe that we are above another species just because they move slower.
Well, by the way, so you know what Paul Stamets is,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, totally.
One of the fascinating things about him is that a lot of people who are not in that world kind of think he's out there, but he has so many interesting things to say about the potential intelligence also of fungi, which are obviously not plants. They're a different.
They're a little bit more advanced than plants. And again, not advanced, a little bit faster.
Yeah,
They have a little bit more complexity in their structure. And by saying that, I'm not saying that plants are not complex. It's just they are more. It's like comparing an eukaryote to a prokaryote.
yeah, and the experiences, for example, with psilocybin mushrooms are very, very interesting, and they have very different characteristics. They have the characteristics often of people speaking with the mushroom directly, and that's a different it's a different character of experience, and so I think the point that you brought up is excellent, which is there's a bunch of things that we assume, right? One, the problem with one of the struggles that I had, which is why I became a vegan. I think this is something that very well-intentioned vegans and vegetarians have, is the problem is that for evolutionary reasons, you empathize with things that are closer to you. So we empathize with, especially the larger the animal gets, right? Like, so most people don't really care about rats, but the larger the animal gets, the more struggles people have often with the idea of killing and eating that animal, right? But we don't seem to care about plants, and we also don't seem to ever think about, whether it's for plants or fungi, what their evolutionary strategies are, and they don't do things, as you said, for our benefit. This is one of the things that's been very interesting to me about this whole new carnivore movement, which I'm sure you're quite aware of. And I have to say, even though I am not one, I think that it is likely to be a benefit, of a net good, because there are a lot of people in that movement who I see that are starting to talk about people like Diana Rogers who want to figure out sustainable ag solutions for the future. And they're also adopting, particularly a guy named Paul Saladino. I don't know if you've come across him, but Saladino, even though I'm a little questionable at some of his arguments, I'm looking forward to meeting him at AHS this year. But at the very least, they're taking an evolutionary view of the world. Now, that view may end up being incorrect, right? But it's a really good place to start. This idea that should be the basis of your worldview. I think, I know you and I, and probably many of the listeners to the podcast, I think is dead on. But a big part of that is the stance taken in that world, that by the more intelligent and nuanced people in that community, that plants are not here to serve us. They have their own evolutionary strategies. Why are we not talking about this? And as far as I'm concerned, whenever people start to do that, that's a net good, because that means we're going towards a more cohesive map for the modern world in terms of thinking about what we are.
So, respect the plant, respect the medicine. Now, let's say you have gone through all of those, all of those checklists, and you're ready to, you are prepared and ready to experience this type of medicine. Describe to us how the ceremony or steps, how you go through the steps, and then what have been the most radical changes or the most radical benefits that you've seen in your experience with this type of medicine?
With respect to ceremony and tradition and the preparation, etc., that is totally dependent upon the plant itself and the tradition that it's placed in, if it's placed in a tradition at all, right? Because one of the things is that we're now in this weird place in human history where these things are now becoming much more popular because they are powerful. We've always used them. And also they provide a lot of very potentially powerful answers to the problems of modern civilization: PTSD, trauma, illness, etc. But the problem is that because indigenous people's ways of life are being wiped out through assimilation, through simply dying off because of lack of territory, etc., you don't have as many traditions left where there is an established tradition and there are still indigenous people who regularly run these kinds of ceremonies for outsiders as well, right? So that's one of the reasons why in the ayahuasca world, the Shipibo tradition, it's one of the reasons. There are others, like there have been documentaries made about them. But the Shipibo people are the most well-known tradition, and they have, their tradition. And my ayahuasca mentor, even though I'm not training to be an ayahuasca practitioner, it's just Shipibo trained practitioner. And so their way of doing things is a set way, right? So you have a dieta, a diet, and that includes, getting rid of fermented foods and red meat and pork and a bunch of other things, and caffeine and sex. And that's also very varied depending on who you talk to, right? How long those exact prohibitions have been in place. But in the case of San Pedro, what I work with, San Pedro is a desert and a mountain plant. It's a cactus. And so it doesn't exist in the jungle. But there are not tribes necessarily that still use the San Pedro as their sacrament and then kind of accept outsiders in and run ceremonies like that. So there are all different kinds of traditions up in the Andes. The way that we do it is there is basically it's a walk, essentially a walk in the mountains in the Andes in a place where there are basically no people, and there's a ceremony that's set up. It's kind of complicated, but essentially the ceremony invokes the spirit of the teacher plant and the sun and Mother Earth, and there are altars which are made in each of the four directions throughout the ceremony, and then the ceremony is closed. So there's an opening, there's the walk, there's the four altars which are set up, and there are prayers made at each altar, and each of the altars represents each of the directions, north, south, east, west, and then you end up back at the end of the trail after many hours, and then you close the ceremony.
Do you collect the plant during the ceremony, or has the plant already been harvested?
So you, as the curandero, so I'm not a curandero yet. I'm training to be one. My teacher is. And so we go out and we harvest the plant. And most of the plants actually, in my case, are grown in the yard of my teacher. They do grow wild, but you can also get them and grow them and just cultivate them on your own land. They're very hardy because they're cactus, And so then, a few days before the ceremony, 1 to 3 days really, before the ceremony, we make the medicine. That involves, collecting it and cutting it and cooking it and making the medicine, storing the medicine. And then, a few days later, you do the ceremony. It's already made.
In a very myopic kind of, I need to understand everything question, have you tried to put any evolutionary connection or evolutionary explanation to the pre-ritual or to the preparation?
Yeah, I have. That's not really my teacher's world, so I don't really put it on him. But yeah, I think that this is something I'm studying right now. Is I try to spend my time when I'm not running around doing crazy stuff here, and then trying to run my own business. The rest of my time is really just devoted to studying and continuing to learn. And so what I think is that with respect to ceremony, all of the particular elements, let's say the merit of including one particular element over the other of a ceremony is definitely not clear to me yet. That's going to involve a lot of thinking on my part. But what I have thought of is that when you get really close to the earth, meaning when you get closer to living as people have lived for almost the entirety of human history, which is to say you are a part of nature. You don't call things nature because you're just in it. It's just life, right? You don't call things the wild because that would be ridiculous because you're just a part of it. So the closer you get to that, there's a reverence, and I was alluding to this before in our conversation. There's a reverence for the life that you are given from the sun and from the earth, right? Because really, those two things combined made you. There's no coincidence that in every kind of indigenous tradition that you see that. And along my own path, that's something that, there is a place you can go to eventually where you lose. It's a scary place for a lot of people. I don't think that they'd want to do it, although I suggest that I said it would be better for them if they did. It would be certainly better for all of us in my estimation. But, there's a place you can go to where you can continue to shed all kinds of identity until you are left with essentially thinking of the earth as your mother and the sun as your father. And so in the ceremony, and that's a place I've been now for a while, because I'm just connected to that. And I think the closer you get to living in the actual earth, the easier that becomes, right? It would be even easier for me if I just lived, as a hunter-gatherer. It'd be obvious. That is something that I've noticed. And also so in other words, the reverence for those things are a part of all traditional ceremony. And I think they evolved over time because, like I said, the identities that we have in the modern Western world are not going to be the same as the identities that people have about themselves in hunter-gatherer land. When you live close to the earth, it's your mother and father. Yes, you have a biological mother and father, but the mother and father, the true overarching mother and father, are these things connected to the earth and the sun.
It's like we don't have the appropriate word. We call it mother and father, but it's beyond that. We just can't describe it with our limited lexicon. So we use the most appropriate or closest word that we have, but it has a deeper meaning or a different meaning, because you might love your parents a lot, and it might feel weird calling the sun father and the earth mother, but it's just a different word, and we experience, as bilinguals, we experience that, that there are some things that just don't fit. I was thinking the other day how there is no word in English to say provecho after, you see someone eating or something, like there's no actual word. And what we say is like, have a nice dinner, but it's not the same. It doesn't have the same meaning. It's a good substitute to have good manners if you see someone eating or you're saying goodbye or, whatever, but there's no actual word. So we use the closest word that we can gather, but it's not as deep, it's not as meaningful as using the right word within your own language.
That's exactly right. Let's go back to the thing we were talking about before with map, right? Language is a psychotechnology, but it's a map that attempts to, and we have so many of them, English and Spanish for you and me, and there's, I don't know how many of the languages there are right now that still exist in the world, but they are not the terrain. They are not actual human emotion and thought. They're ways of trying to represent it. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, the mother and father thing with respect to the sun and the earth is just the language that you seem to go to immediately. There are people who've tried to also have language that goes beyond that kind of unites the two, and it's something like the source or something like that. But yeah, so anyway, to continue answering your question, I think that the reverence for the earth and the sun and the mountains, also there in the Andes, the mountains are referred to as apus, and these mountains are also considered to be great teachers. And so in the place that we go, which is very high up, and there are no people there, you're in the mountains, you're in big mountains, So there's a reverence for the place that you are. There's a reverence for, and that is constantly reinforced in the ceremony concerning the earth and the sun with respect to like where your life and your vitality actually comes from. And then there's a constant reverence for the teacher plant, which in this case would be San Pedro, the cactus. But there are also other plants like tobacco, for example, which are used in the ceremony a lot of times. And in my case, it's used. And sometimes other plants as well, like rose, at the end of a ceremony to basically convey a feeling of cleaning. There's a rose petals that will sometimes be like basically tossed over you. These ways of doing things have deep kind of mythological meanings. They're metaphorically true, but they aren't universal in the sense that everyone does the ceremony in the same way, right? it's only really, like I said, certain tribes that still exist that have a certain fixed way of doing things. The Shipibo are a good example in ayahuasca, where everything is, more or less like the same structure, same way all the time. You know what I mean?
Now, to extrapolate from that, I know that psychedelic tourism has gained a lot of popularity, and we've seen celebrities do it, and they do documentaries, and we hear about things like microdosing that's happening in the Silicon Valley, and and it can be like so reductionistic to the point that you can use it as a biohack. What are your feelings and opinions on that?
I don't love it. I've done it many times myself as an experiment, and just to see, kind of to get experience on it and know what I really think about it. But what I think is that, first of all, let's handle the topic of microdosing, and then I'll go to the psychedelic tourism. With respect to microdosing, I see the same problem that I see with marijuana, for example, and alcohol, which is that you're taking something, but this thing doesn't actually have a place in your worldview. And so what you think is that, well, you're going to take something and it's going to give you a result that's like a nootropic or something. And the reality is that that's true for a lot of people. That's really true. So it's not that they don't work, just like it's not like pharmaceuticals don't work sometimes. And they are way, way, way better for you than pharmaceuticals at microdoses. I mean, I definitely advocate them over most pharmaceuticals. But the problem, again, is that I don't see them being attached to anything. I just see them being used as a quote-unquote biohack. And to me, that's not a sustainable solution for anything, and it's a good recipe for misuse.
Mismatch.
Yeah, it's just like you think that, well, I'm going to take LSD because LSD makes me more productive, which is why people in Silicon Valley take it. And it's true. It's totally true that in microdoses that this thing can help you be more productive and change the way your brain works. But do we know what you taking that casually without any sense of ceremony, without any connection to it, is going to do over many years? No, we have no idea. And it's true that psychedelics are generally considered to be not toxic. That's totally true. And it's totally true that these things are way safer, especially in microdoses, than pharmaceuticals. I completely agree. But I still don't like that. I know why people do it. There are significant benefits. I would certainly never deny those things. They're real. But I do worry about the long-term mindless use of these things.
And I'm going to make a quick example. Let's talk about the sun and light, okay? So you wake up in the morning, you go outside, full dose of sun. It's going to stop the production of melatonin, and it's going to make you more productive, and it's going to kind of stop your sleepiness right on its tracks, and you're going to feel better. Okay, let's microdose blue light then. And now you have your phone and you have your computer and you under fluorescent lights. That same blue light microdosed throughout the day now is disrupting your circadian rhythm. So we can take something that could be very useful in an evolutionarily appropriate way. And when we kind of engineer it to be in our lives because we think we're smarter than we are, it can have really bad repercussions for you long term.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I have to say that does worry. It also worries me that, that movement in the United States in particular, I am not worried about it in Peru because these things are considered to be sacred medicine here, right? Now, the other incredibly valuable psychedelics that are out there, or in the case of MDMA and pathogens, they are not really used here, or at least I don't believe that they're legal. I've never come across them. So it's certainly limited to the sacred plants of this place, but they're totally legal and totally allowed and part of healing in this society for a lot of people. So I'm not worried about that. But in the case of the United States, I do worry about things like going off the rails like they did in the 70s. And the only way that would happen, I think, is if people just started to be really, really irresponsible about using them, which is, I think, happening. But let's hope it doesn't ruin it for a lot of other people.
What about psychedelic tourism? It's like a double-edged sword because it is bringing some promotion or awareness towards the use of psychedelics for medicinal use. In fact, I'm right now just talking about this, to bring awareness to my listeners and, the potential of the healing capacities of psychedelics. But what about when it becomes a trip where you stay at a cabana and, someone is, preparing or, I've heard about places where you can go to like a hospital-like setting and they do the whole ceremony in this very sterile environment.
Yeah. And I think that the answer is that I think that psychedelic tourism is much better for people than doing it where they live. However, major caveat, a lot of the places are terrible. It's a double-edged sword, right? It's like that's not the correct phrase, but there's advantages, but there's significant downside is probably a better way of saying it. So the reason I say that I think it would be better I think psychedelic tourism is better than staying at home is because, again, if you come to the right place, like where I started, right in the Amazon, you are in a place that is completely about healing. You are separated from your normal environment, which does wonderful things. Just the concept of retreats in general, having nothing to do with psychedelic plants. I mean, I just ran a retreat off of Vancouver Island, and I'm going to run one, I think, in October. And I run retreats, and I'll run them, I think, for a long time. And I don't care if I make any money, really, because it's the best way. I mean, I'd like to make some money, but it's the best way that I found to achieve massive change, because you get people in an environment where they're surrounded by other people who care for them, and the space that they're in is completely devoted to healing and is separate from the thing that they normally do. What you see in the psychedelic world in the US, for example, or any place in the modern Western world, is that, well, especially because these things are illegal, you have to go to some underground thing. But even if it were, the problem is that then people go back to work like the next day.
Or they're doing it while they're at work.
Yeah, exactly. But in the case of them doing like an actual ceremony, right? Let's say you do an ceremony at night, and then people are like going back to work the next day or 2 days later, and it's like they haven't done any of the really hard work of integration afterwards, and they're not separated from their normal reality, and they need to gain separation from it. So I think that retreats of all kinds are incredibly helpful to people because they can allow you to gain separation from a lot of the things that you're doing that are not a good idea. Right? You have a much better way of looking back at your normal life and be like, I don't want to go back and do that. And they can provide really good resources for integration, the really, really good places, but there aren't many of them. So anyway, there's that. But then there's another really big positive, which is, let's say you come to work with me or right now, since I don't take people on myself yet, but you work with my teacher, right? You're getting a connection to the land and the plant that you cannot get. It will never happen. It's not going to happen in the United States. It's just not going to happen because the plant is grown here. The person, like myself and my teacher, we harvest it and then we pray to the plant. We are basically like, we are treating it with reverence at every step of the path, every step of the preparation process. And that kind of connection, and then being in the place, being out in nature, for example, whether it's in the Amazon or up in the mountains or wherever it is, being in the place where that thing actually grows and was just harvested is a massive difference. And you getting to start to slowly you're not going to get the same kind of experience as someone who lives here, obviously, but and who works with them, but you're starting to get a different perspective on your connection to the earth and your connection to this particular plant and this ceremony. But like I said, that's not going to happen elsewhere.
It's the difference between going to a fast food restaurant and getting a meal. Sure, it has good calories and you can make it as healthy as possible. But it's going to be very different than if you go to your grandma's house and then that same food is being prepared with the best ingredients in the proper preparation. It's like the difference of going to Taco Bell and then going to my mom's house for a home cooked dinner. Sure, you're scratching the itch of getting some Mexican food, but one of them is gonna be much better for you than the other.
Yeah, and it's also the difference between, you might even say it's the difference between, because I used to live in LA, and LA has great Mexican food, right? Like legitimate, like regional, authentic Mexican food. But there's a big difference between that even and going to like a doña's house in a small town in Mexico and sitting there while she prepares the food that comes from that little town.
In an evolutionary appropriate way, soaking the
Yeah,
beans, maybe even butchering the goat themselves, and it's an experience rather than just a consumption of calories.
right. And Timothy Leary, who was the kind of public enemy number one in the Nixon administration in the '70s, and is a big reason why that psychedelic revolution kind of went off the rails, and then research was made illegal up until recently. He was fond of using that term "set and setting," and certainly one of his major contributions to, I believe he's the one that came up with it, not Ramdas. But yeah, but that setting is kind of what we're talking about, right? Which is that people undervalue the vast difference in the experience based on the set and setting, and also I would say based on the preparation and the integration afterwards. And so I think that the psychedelic tourism thing, for right now, and probably for a very long time, because even if they were to become legal in the United States, the problem would still be then, do you actually have a connection, right? The psychedelics that grow in the United States are psilocybin mushrooms, Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and peyote in the Southwest, although peyote is endangered because people, pick them and they take a long time to grow. So even if you could make them legal, the problem would still be that, from my perspective, that people are still treating them like pharmaceuticals. You have to then build traditions around them, which are deeply connected to the earth, because that's essentially what we are, right? We're still animals that are well adapted to living essentially as hunter-gatherers. But even if you wanted to make the case that we are well adapted to being pastoralists or doing some degree of horticulture and agriculture, you're still a thing that needs to be connected to the earth in some way.
And maybe, we are adapting to this new way of utilizing hallucinogenic drugs, as in maybe in 100,000 years, it'll be okay to take some microdosing and there's not going to be any ill effect because we would have adapted to that type of dosing. But at this point, we're far from that.
Yeah, and I don't worry so much about I guess I do worry about the physiological effect of, with respect to how well adapted we are. But the problem is that when we talk about things that we're well adapted to, culture is evolutionary as well, right? So culture evolves and it is operated on by selection processes as well. And there are so many things about the mythological structures that are true. And they're very, very, very deep, which is, I think, a big reason for Peterson's popularity, who we discussed before, right? He tells old stories, and sometimes, most of the time, I find myself agreeing with him, sometimes not. But his point is that what you truly believe, and this is something I very much believe, what you truly believe is not really what you say you believe. It's what you act out in the world. This is my observation, is that even very intelligent people think that the rational mind is enough to tell them what they believe. So they think that they know what they believe, but it's not really true at all. The things that you believe are largely, I would say, probably in your unconscious. And that means that there are all these mythological structures. The reason why you could watch like The Lion King, or you can watch Marvel movies or Star Wars or whatever, and they have all these mythological structures, and you suspend disbelief completely and accept these things and instantly understand them. And that's because they're really old, even though obviously no societies before us could have made a movie like Star Wars, right? Both for technological reasons and also because we've now had like a culture that kept making sci-fi stuff. So we have all these different fantasy ideas, but they're still based on these older mythological structures that are in our unconscious and that are very old. And so I think about that too when I think about what people are well adapted to, right? Because that's a difficult conversation.
And listen, we've been taking advantage of grains for hundreds of thousands of years, and we are still not fully adapted to them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that's definitely true. We've been using grain on a large scale for a pretty short amount of time. You can get away with, like you talked about, with microdosing. Like maybe it's possible over a long time to become well adapted to the use of the use of those tools on a regular basis. I don't know, but we've been using grains as a significant part of the diet for a very short amount of time.
Short amount in evolutionary time speaking.
Yes.
So it's not 1,000 years that we've been using grain. It's hundreds of thousands of years that we've been using grain. We found bread and lentils in, some of our ancestors. Still, there are some people that react negatively. And this is technology that has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, which is a short time, evolutionarily speaking.
Yeah, well, I would add two caveats. One is that as far as I understand, like large scale grain use is probably somewhere around 10 to 14,000 years, depending on where your ancestor comes from, right? But we definitely used grain as I would say was almost certainly like fallback food, survival food, for longer than that. But they were just very small amounts of the diet.
Supplemental, yeah.
Yeah, and when you have a bunch of other things going on, like no chronic stress and no artificial light, and highly nutritious animal foods where you're eating nose to tail, you could survive that probably fairly easily. But that gets back also to the themes of our conversation, which is one, do things the way people have always done. So people that eat grain now, I personally don't eat any grain. I think it's a net negative for both your health and also for the environment. I think it's completely unsustainable. But if you do, you should do things the way you always have done. That's why I see people who are very serious Ayurvedic practitioners. I don't think that Ayurveda is a very good map, right? I think it's highly limited when it comes from the Indian subcontinent, where they were trying to figure out answers to modern agricultural life problems. And I don't think that that's actually what human beings ought to do, but it's a map. And if you actually look at Ayurvedic practitioners, and if you're out there and you're listening to this and for some reason you want to eat a bunch of grain, go look at what traditional Ayurvedic practitioners recommend with respect to grains and legumes. It's heavy amounts of soaking and fermenting to get rid of digestive irritants and to extract the most nutrition out of those foods. That's a good example of why you should do things the way they've always been done, because those people didn't know the biochem, but they are getting a lot more nutrition out of their food and irritating their gut a lot less. And it's no coincidence, I think, even though it's anecdotal, that when I meet people who are Ayurvedic practitioners, they tend to look fairly healthy. There are exceptions, I'm sure, to that. But when I get into asking them, I had a woman on my retreat recently. She was an Ayurvedic practitioner, and I got into asking her about her diet, and I noticed she was taking her soaking of grains and legumes really seriously. Like she never made an exception, And she talked about how her skin had improved and a bunch of digestive problems had gone away and stuff like that. And again, it's like I think that's a very limited map. But the point is that there's real value in doing things the way people have always done, who have a lot less chronic illness than we do. And the second thing is that our conversation about one of our themes also was just thinking about the strategies of plants, right? So we kind of tend to think, most people just think that they think of food as food, and they tend to make this strange separation between animal foods and plant foods, but not in the evolutionary way, right? What they should be thinking about is, I think you all know, Harari wrote in *Sapiens*. I don't know if you've read that book, but it's very good. He made the argument that, that grains, of course, had their own evolutionary strategy, and also maybe selected us, right, to help continue their genes, which I think is probably true. Again, it's this. We tend to think that plants don't have any kind of intelligence, but they have their own strategy. I don't think that it certainly does not seem to be, it's not obvious to me why we should think that human beings just by themselves decided to start large-scale agriculture. I think that it was kind of a combined effort.
And any deviation from a standard American diet is going to be a plus for health. So like if you're eating nothing but junk food and then you decide to follow a vegetarian or a vegan diet, you're going to have some improvement in your health. That does not mean that that's the optimal diet. So eating in excess of your BMR and eating nothing but processed foods like cookies and chips and soda, and then you're like, you know what, I need to do something with my diet, and then you start drinking Soylent, you're going to have a positive benefit. Is that the best diet? No, but you're going to have some positive benefit. And then you go vegan, and you're eating, more fruits and vegetables and, less processed foods. You're going to have another improvement. And then you decide to go paleo, and you're going to have a bigger impact. So, a change in health does not mean that that's the best diet. It just means that what you were doing before was probably really shitty.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And I think in her case, in the woman's case I mentioned, that's definitely true. And the thing about it is that when people make changes, the thing I keep coming back to for a lot of my clients, and we've talked now about a bunch, is you can make a change away from the standard American diet, and you will improve to some degree. There's probably exceptions to that. So, for example, if you went from the standard American diet to a very strict vegan diet, you would think you would see changes from removing a bunch of things. But then let's say, for example, you have a particular problem with converting to whole vitamin A and you can't do that, and you were getting some on your previous diet, then you might actually run into worse problems in a way. But generally speaking, yeah, that's 100% right. And I think what you and I and everyone in the ancestral health world needs to start to work on is figuring out, well, you and I do work on this in our private practice, but as an aim of the entire movement is to figure out how to say, yeah, you can make all these changes. Good for you. I'm glad that you made the change. But if you don't have an explanatory view of the world, if you don't have a view of the world that gives you explanatory power, then that change that you made is probably not going to be sufficient, because you're not going to know why you did it. You're not going to know what changes you need to make going forward when you stall. And there are all kinds of questions that if posed to you, you won't have any kind of answer for, because you don't have an explanatory view of the world. That's what the ancestral movement, that's what makes it so unique and powerful. I mean, that's what makes it the best thing there is in modern medicine.
Yeah, and that's a great thought, to end this conversation. Daniel, where can people find your work? Where can people get to you? You're going to be at AHS, and then you're going to do a couple of workshops around the area. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you find me on danielcortez.com. The current Instagram and Facebook is at Daniel Cortez Coaching. You can email me at daniel@danielcortez.com if you'd like. And all of my information, including this podcast, will eventually be on danielcortez.com. I have a newsletter, people can sign up for on the website. That's how I keep people up to date with, what I'm doing, my work, my workshops, is the newsletter primarily in the website. And then I'll post some stuff every once in a while to the social media. And I will be at AHS speaking about conquering chronic illness with psychedelics, doing a poster presentation there. And then I will probably be doing a Wim Hof and ancestral health kind of one-day workshop in LA, and then probably Oakland. Those have to be finalized right now.
Awesome, dude. Thank you for the interview. This is so fascinating. Let's see if in around 6 months we can, circle back and have you again, and we can go even deeper into this amazing topic.
Yeah, I would love to, because in 6 months, one of the things that's interesting is, just given the nature of what I do, is that things change very quickly. Because if you're really dedicated to transformation, once you go really far down the path, you can achieve tremendous transformation relatively quickly. Again, it's about having a map of the world, and then having concepts that you can draw from to make change quickly, right? Instead of kind of flailing about. And so it's in 6 months. Yeah, it would be wonderful. It'd be really interesting to see what's going on.
Awesome. Well, nice to have you, and I can't wait to meet you IRL, and I'll talk to you soon, man.
All right. Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.